Hi, everybody. We're glad you're here today. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. We are here today on Movers and Shakers, and again, we're with Graig Morley. Now, Graig is a personal friend. Graig is a friend of the show. He's been here many times, but one of the reasons he's been here many times is because he's got a lot of answers to a lot of questions. Now, before we get involved, we have to go through the legal stuff. Graig is a sitting member of the Appraisal Standards Board, but he is not here in that function. He is not speaking for the ASB. He's speaking as a state certified general real estate appraiser in 3 states and someone who is deeply involved in real estate appraisal. So, Graig, with the legalities out of the way, thank you for being here. How are you today?
Very well. It's nice to be here on this nice warm summer day and spend a little time with you.
Yeah, Southern Utah. We're taping this in the middle of July, so a summer day in Southern Utah in July is not exactly what you would call alpine brisk in any sense of the imagination. Graig, I've got a number of questions. Some of these are my own, some have come in from other people, and I wanted to run them past you. Let's take the first one. The first one is it a positive or a negative that the GSEs are moving away from reporting forms and toward more narrative reporting? And the reason I ask this is simply because, given what the GSEs are doing, we're not going to be filling out forms anymore. We're going to be writing pretty much, in many cases, what amounts to a narrative appraisal, given the changes that the GSEs are making in the way we report to them. So again, is this a positive or is this a negative?
I believe it's a positive. Tim, I think the thing that the GSEs have discovered is that the current reporting format is not working particularly well. The forms are old. They were designed when, in many cases, people were using typewriters. The format was designed so that you get 3 comps on a page side by side, and all of a sudden, well, 3 comps is the magic number for determining how much data should be considered in developing your opinion of value. And I think this change, it's far more than just the reporting format. They're changing the data standards and trying to make the reporting so that it will not require an appraiser to determine, well, what form am I going to use? It's going to be more along the line of I'm going to identify the characteristics of the property, and based on those characteristics, we'll determine what information is needed to describe the property properly and what kind of analysis I need to perform to develop the opinion of value and some of the other information that the lender and intended users need to make a risk assessment for the property. And that appraisal then becomes a vital tool in some cases where they determine an appraisal is needed, that I think it's going to be much better. And once appraisers get used to the change in the way that this is done, I think you'll see fewer revision requests. The reports will be more consistent in terms of where to find information about the property. And I think in the end, it's going to be an improvement from what we've had in the past.
Okay, let's follow up on that. And this is a question that could proceed from any number of other questions and answers, but let's append this question to the answer that you just gave about more precise appraisals, more narrative work, easier to understand, easier to follow, etc. So in the future, are we going to see fewer real estate appraisers? And if so, why?
I think the demand for the traditional residential real estate appraiser is probably, at least in the short run, going to decline. And primarily because, number one, the demand for appraisers and appraisals in the current lending environment is not as great. Interest rates are high. There's less market activity going on. And if you were to base that determination on the current market, we have too many appraisers. Now, the reality is we have a lot of appraisers aging out and retiring. And we've got a number of people. It's surprising to see how many people are trying to get into the appraisal profession. And so I think that you will see that we're going to probably have fewer residential appraisers doing GSE type work, because the GSEs are backing away from having an appraisal done on every loan. They're using their various risk analytics to determine if an appraisal is even needed. And if an appraisal is needed, the way that those appraisals are engaged is going to be different from what it has traditionally been, with the use of data collectors and so forth. So that I think that at least in the GSE lending environment, you're probably not going to need as many appraisers as what we've had in the past.
You mentioned in your first response changes in data standards. Let's talk about that for a second. Theoretically, a computer program ought to be able to access any database from any county or city clerk in the U.S. And pull data in order to use it to come up with a value conclusion. But yet we know that's impossible, because MLSs are not on the same database as clerks. In some, I remember hearing a story many years ago in one rural county in one very rural state. The database consisted of 2 shelves of files in the home of the daughter of the county clerk. And that was the entire database system. And if you wanted to know what a cell was, you went over to her house and you pulled the file. Now, I know that various authorities have been trying to work on what's called MISMO, MISMO, which is an attempt to make the same all databases. So computers, especially AI to a great extent, can access them to pull data and therefore to analyze data. Any luck on getting this, for lack of a better term, synchronicity to happen, or are we still looking at a bunch of years in the future on that?
No, the GSEs have been updating the MISMO, that MISMO standard. They have that complete. I suspect over time you'll probably see refinements in that, but that's a good deal of the time that it's taken to get this new reporting system into place is the updating of that MISMO standard. That is now completed and is out to the software vendors so that they can implement that standard into the development of the software that would be used to report, to perform the appraisal and generate the report. There are a few refinements. I think one of the problems that we've had across the board is that appraisers are not consistent in the way that they perform their ratings. And it's created a degree of frustration, partially because many times the properties fall in kind of between the lines on the definitions of what constitutes average or good in either quality or condition. And I think probably the unintended consequence with the GSEs doing the report, tracking the appraiser's rating, is that I suppose there's most appraisers who are doing GSE work have gotten a little note from the GSE saying your rating doesn't match your peers. And that's about all they say. They don't tell you if you rated it higher or lower or what the other peers' averages were. And so what we're finding across the board is that many appraisers just rate everything as average or everything as good. A few years ago, maybe a year ago, I was appraising a high-rise condo in Las Vegas in a resort area. And I would be hard-pressed to think that you could spend a lot more on the building and on the individual units. They were very nicely done. And on one of these peer-to-peer reviews, I noticed that many of the appraisers who had performed work in this project were rating everything as average. And I'm looking at this thinking, if this isn't very good to exceptional, you know, a Q2 to a Q1, I'm not sure what would be. And so that has created it's really ultimately undermined the confidence that the GSEs have in the appraisers in performing the ratings, because we've maybe taken the low road in not being using the system the way that it was intended to be used. And the result has been that the GSEs have found that rating system has been less effective than they would like it to be. In fact, I was at a meeting in Washington, D.C. at an appraisal summit that NAR had hosted, and we had a representative from Fannie Mae. And he was looking at properties where the homes were brand new. And his comment was for heaven's sakes, would there be at least some appraisers who would rate these things as a C1, because everything was rated as average. And I think the problem is that as appraisers, you know, we're kind of originally trained in doing things on a relative basis, that moving to an absolute rating system has been very difficult to implement. And so with the changes in the MISMO standards and with some of the data, you know, I personally have advocated for a little more granular rating, so that when you have properties that fall between the cracks, you know, it's better than average, but it's not quite good. How do I reflect that? And how do I perform analysis that reflects those differences? And while they haven't addressed that specific concern, they have, I believe, the plan at this point will be is that you'll be able to rate the exterior of the property and the interior of the property separately from each other, which I think is a step in the right direction, so that if I've got a good quality exterior and average quality finish, I'll be able to reflect that in my report. And if appraisers will use the standards the way they're intended, I think it will not only provide better appraisal results, but I think our value in the system will improve. And that's ultimately what we want to do, is to create value in the services that we perform, so that we are doing a better job than the data collectors or anyone else.
Speaking of data collectors, Craig, you mentioned a moment ago that appraisers were, you know, good, average, fair, poor, and you walk into a building where everything is a C1. Well, if you take 10 ones and you add them together, you get 10, and divide by 10, you get 1. Therefore, 1 is the average. And that's probably where appraisers are coming from. But yet you mentioned an absolute scale versus a relative scale. And is the GSE's move to data collectors and the training they're going to receive an attempt to move away from the appraiser's relative scale into their own absolute scale?
In my opinion, that's exactly what part of the problem has been, is that as appraisers, we have not done that very well. And, you know, the old idiom that it's hard to teach an old dog new tricks seems to be true, at least in this case. And so I think the idea is that if we take someone and train them the way that they want the information to be reported, that may improve that reporting. Now, it remains to be seen if that's actually going to work. And some of the anecdotal reports we get back is that the data collectors haven't been as precise as I think many would like to see it be. But, you know, we'll have to see how that works out.
Okay, that may be a function of more experience and more training. All right. Craig, something that you and I discuss privately relatively regularly. What is one area of maintaining a work file that real estate appraisers must improve in right now?
The work file is such a vital thing that we use as a tool. I think maybe there's two things that I would advise. If number one is if I'm doing desktop appraisal work, I need to make sure that I have put all of the information that has been collected, even if that information was provided by my client. We've got, as we transition into doing more of the desktop third-party assistance, in providing the data, it becomes more important for the appraiser to have support for the opinions and conclusions that they have developed, even when those opinions and conclusions are based on information provided by a third party. And so making sure that I've got my public record data in, my information that I used from third parties in the work file, as well as you'd had a little visit with Craig Capilla not long ago, and as Craig had pointed out, is that if you have opinions and conclusions that were developed that are not contained within the body of the report, they need to be in the work file. If you've done a cost approach, but you didn't put it in the report, make sure it's in the work file. If you've developed adjustments for various differences between the subject and the comparable sales, they should be in the work file if it's not in the report. And so I think that, together with organizing your work file so that it makes sense, nothing is more frustrating and maybe undermines the credibility of an appraiser, is that when a work file is provided to the regulatory agency and it's a jumble of documents that make no sense. And so having these things clearly labeled and identified, I have your letter of engagement, critical piece of information, that making sure that you've got your public record data and all of the other elements that were relied on in developing the report. If you relied on information on other appraisals, at least reference the other reports that you'd considered, so that when the if for whatever reason you need to produce that work file, you've got all of the information that you relied on in developing your appraisal, and if you do that, it'll save you lots and lots of problems.
Craig, you and I both counsel appraisers, especially when they are up before their appraisal boards. And one of the things that you and I have both found is that the appraiser has in the work file a copy of the appraisal. And the bad part of that is sometimes not much more. So let's talk about what you and I have both called in the past privately iterations. In other words, you do a cost approach and you go, well, okay, let me stick another 5% depreciation in there and see what happens. And you do that and you go, it still doesn't make sense. Let me put in another 5%. And you go, oh, now it makes sense. Okay, now this is starting to explain what's going on in the market. But what happens is the appraiser puts in the report that last iteration of the cost approach and throws everything else out, because those were not what the appraiser used to arrive at a value conclusion. But yet, are not those, and I'm going to call them mistakes, are not those mistakes part of what led the appraiser to the value conclusion? Therefore, should not those mistakes be part of the work file? Shouldn't those iterations be part of the work file?
I think it's always a great idea to include more information than what may be necessary to meet the minimum requirement. And the iterative process is not necessarily, I don't know if I'd call it a mistake. I would call it some analysis that I was going through to develop. I'm looking at various scenarios to determine which of the universe of possibilities that exists is the one that makes the most sense given the data that's available to me. Now, one of the little known factors, and if you're using the total appraisal software, one of the little known features that exist within that software is that it has a timeline, and it will record every iteration of the report over the timeline. And so I can go into my timeline and look at what I've done and see that process. So, for example, we're doing analysis on comparable sales, and we're trying to use some kind of iterative process in making adjustments. I can go through and say, I'm going to adjust my age or condition or size or these various elements at a particular rate, and it comes back and it's moving the adjusted values or the values indicated by the adjusted sales further away from each other. I look at that and say, well, these adjustments clearly are not reflective of the market. So I come and try some alternatives that draw that range closer together and say, yeah, okay, it looks like I'm headed in the right direction. I'm narrowing the indicated values. And as I do that, total is keeping track over a timeline. You may want to play with that to make sure it's giving you the kind of results that you can use to support what you're doing. But from my perspective, that's a pretty useful tool. And I suspect there's quite a number of appraisers using the software that are completely unaware that that's going on in the background. But it's never a bad idea to take a quick screenshot, drag it into your work file. Total's got a built-in work file where I can just take a screenshot, drag it right into the tab, and it's there. And then I've got it for the rest of forever, in my in my total work file. But there are some really useful tools that make that process easy, but it just takes an extra 30 seconds to go do that. And I think as you find yourself standing before some court or regulatory agency and they're asking you how this was developed, having that that analysis in a format that allows you to be able to explain it. And so one of the things that, if I was being called before my regulatory agency, I might want to print off a copy of the report or the relevant portions of the report based on my total timeline, so that you can see how the results were developed over that timeline, and it provides some useful information. Much of this, I think, would depend upon your board. How some are very difficult to deal with and are looking for the tiniest of mistakes to penalize you. Others are a little less oppressive when it comes to some of that, but it's always better to have that support than not to have the support.
Craig, you're talking about, by the way, Total is not a sponsor of this program, but just we both like the program. All right. Now, you mentioned Total maintaining a timeline. Okay. So you get contacted by a lender, an AMC, somebody, and it says, oh, yeah, we want you to use our proprietary software on our website. So you do. Now, two questions. Number one, does that proprietary reporting form on their website maintain a timeline, as you've indicated Total does? And number two, if you discover a mistake, if you need to make an addition, if you need to send something to your state relative to that appraisal and appraisal report, is accessing the data from the client's website, accessing their proprietary database, is that really going to work for you, or is that going to prove to be a problem?
It's going to prove to be a problem. And here's the interesting thing, is that as we start doing more of the desktop work, I don't have any data that supports my belief or opinions on this, but I think the likelihood of having a borrower who's unhappy with the results, particularly where the appraiser did not look at the property personally, that it opens the door for additional complaints. And they're going to, if I'm a borrower and I get my results back and I'm not happy with it, well, how could this appraiser know about my property when he's never seen the property and he relied on information by a third party? And my property has this magnificent view and the comparable sales that they selected did not. and the appraiser didn't even account for that difference. Well, how now am I, as the appraiser, going to support that? Well, I didn't really think there was a big view difference. And by the way, I didn't look at the property. So if there was a view, how would I know that? And that's where I think making sure that, number one, you've got complete information being provided by the third party, and looking at your Google Map and other things that would give you a clue as to, does it back open space? Does it back a golf course? Is it back, a mountain range that provides some unobstructed views? And for me to be able to reconcile that and then have that information in my file becomes pretty important. And so I hope that those who are providing those kinds of services, I think you can do it. I think you can do it without difficulty and having problems, provided that you have the supporting documentation for the opinions and conclusions that you've developed in your work file. And that's where I see appraisers stepping into an environment where the possibility of having complaints levied against you exist, because there were characteristics either in view or other physical characteristics of the property that exist and have a material impact on value, but aren't being reported within the body of the report that's being provided to the client intended users.
Have to hit all the right buttons here. All right. In line with that, you're a former state regulator. You still consult with the Utah board. What is it an appraiser can do relative to his or her state board in order to avoid having anything to do with his or her state board?
Yeah, all things being equal, you just as soon not have to attend a hearing, and you can't stop people being unhappy with the appraisal results, because that's always going to happen. And you're going to have that small few people who, if I don't get my way, I'm going to send in a complaint, and that is going to happen, and you won't be able to stop that from occurring. But probably the very first thing, and I got this from one of our state regulators who said, we would cut down on 70% of the complaints that are levied against appraisers and real estate agents if they would just be nice. And what happens is that appraisers get a call, oftentimes inappropriately, from an unhappy party, an agent, a borrower, someone who's not a client or intended user. And the appraiser gets the call and he says, "I'm sorry, I can't talk with you," and hangs up. And that then escalates the likelihood that you're going to get a complaint filed against you. And the reality is most of these people have no idea what your confidentiality requirements are on an appraisal. And so it becomes an opportunity to be able to educate those people and help them understand, say, I would be happy to talk with you about, you may not be happy to talk with them about it, but, I'm going to tell them, I'd be happy to talk with you about this, but the appraisal is a confidential document. And I'm sorry to tell you, even though you paid for the appraisal, you're not the client or the intended user. And I ethically cannot discuss my assignment results with you without permission from my client, which is your lender. I'm assuming that this is a GSE type, the lender type assignment. And so if you want to get something in writing or have them reach out to me, then I'd be happy to visit with you. But otherwise, you're going to need to get that from them. And at that point, I'd be happy to visit with you. The thing that I always do, and I think has served me well, is point out that, hey, I'm mortal. If I've made a mistake, I want to fix it. I've told many times when people have called me and says, you know what, here's the reality, is that even if I've made a mistake, even if there's an error in what I've done, I have no way to be able to make the change to this report and deliver it back to the client, even if you're right. because oftentimes the way that these reports are delivered is through a portal. And the only way I can deliver that back through the portal is for them to open it up. Secondly, is that if you and I have this conversation and I make the change, it raises the red flag for the regulator that there has been potentially undue influence from a party to the a party of the assignment that is not an intended user or a client, and it raises the red flag of undue influence. Is the appraiser being influenced inappropriately? And so I can't, while I've got the ethical obligations, I've got the practical limitations, and you've got the potential regulatory oversight problems, so that, and as they begin to understand that, my experience has been is it diffuses a lot of the problems. And most of the time, the lender's not going to give permission. And if they do, then I will happily visit with them. But we try to, there's been a number of times where I've explained that how the revision request process goes. If you've got something you want me to consider, I can't do it without your client asking me to do it. So go, or your lender asking me to do it. So go ask them. And if they review it and have, send it to me to look at, I will look at it. And if there's merit to the request, then I'll make the changes. If there's not, then I won't. And it oftentimes will diffuse a lot of the concerns that people have. And I think a lot of the complaints we're seeing across the board, even into the racial bias complaints, it has a foundation in that, where the appraisers' perception with their clients has been colored in some degree with the way that we've treated people while collecting the information about the property and doing the appraisal.
Craig, one more question, if I may, please. And we've not discussed this before, but in line with the fact that there are changes ongoing in appraisal, probably more so now than there have been in the last 10 years. We were notified last week, the first week of July, that Freddie Mac is now transitioning to ANSI, home measurement standards. And Fannie Mae is already there. Freddie Mac had been silent on it, and has now spoken. It's going that way. The other GSEs have not yet said anything, but it'd be surprising if they didn't. But any thoughts on Freddie Mac adopting ANSI standards? And is ANSI all that terribly important, or is that just a tempest in a teapot that appraisers really shouldn't worry about?
Well, I think most of the tempest is pretty well past with the adoption by Fannie Mae. I understand why that they are doing that. And my personal feeling has been, as while I'm not necessarily a fan of the ANSI standard, simply because there's multiple standards there. And, I do work in Nevada, Clark County, Nevada, and they do use a different measurement standard. And so it's always tough when you're looking at the way they measure, and you've got comparable sales that are exactly the same property, and the square footage being reported on the county records is different than what you physically measured. It creates kind of that conundrum of, well, do I change the square footage of the comp to match, where I believe that it's a model match or not? Or how do I reconcile those differences? And that the GSE, Fannie Mae, and I presume Freddie Mac will be adopting similar guidance, provided guidance on how to deal with it. Personally, I believe I've always felt like it's an all or nothing situation is the best. If ANSI is going to be a standard, it's only a standard if everybody adopts it. And if everybody adopts it and has the same guidance, it's better than only having some of the intended users adopt it and others not, and then it creates a degree of confusion. But I think the reality is most of the concern and problems have worked through the system, to where I don't think it should be too big of an issue with the adoption of by Freddie Mac. I think the challenge is just to make sure that you're handling those potential differences properly.
Craig, thank you. We never have enough time on these podcasts to cover everything that needs to be covered. So if someone needed to get in touch with you to ask you some follow-up questions, or even perhaps to consult with you on issues of USPAP, etc., how would they do that?
Email's probably the easiest. My email is valuepro@gmail.com. There's no E in value. That one had been taken, doggone it. So it was VALUPRO@gmail.com. And so send me an email, and I'd be happy to give you whatever perspective I have. And always happy to hear from people. And we hear from people all the time. And it's always nice to get that perspective of the different challenges that people face throughout the country.
Craig, given all you do some traveling. Are you going to be speaking anywhere anytime soon where someone could come and hear you?
You know, I'm not.
Craig, we lost you there. We lost you there for a second. Try again.
Okay. Yeah, no, I don't have anything scheduled. It says my internet's unstable, so that's probably. I think it's talking about me. I'm not sure, but no, I don't have anything scheduled right now. But we are providing some continuing education opportunities here in the next little while. So if you have an interest in looking at getting some ideas on how to do alternative valuations, reports, and some of that, we're going to try to roll some of that out that might be of interest.
Good. Thank you. Again, Craig, I appreciate it. It's always a pleasure to listen to you, to hear your wisdom, to hear your experience. My best to your family, and I look forward to the next time we get to shake each other's hands. Thanks, Craig. We'll be in touch.
Thanks very much, Tim.
Bye-bye.